Hi to everyone. We are starting. It's our second day of the Change Sheet Impact Lab in the framework of the International Human Rights Documentary Film Festival, Docudays. And today we have Caitlin Boyle from the USA, who is a founder of the Film Sprout company. It's a distribution firm, and she will tell us a study case on impact from the grassroots. Actually, Caitlin is an advocate of the film's power to impact and to create grassroots change. And I would like to say less and to invite our guest, please. Caitlin, you are welcome to start your presentation.
Thank you.
So let's welcome Caitlin.
Thank you.
To add just a few words, that Caitlin will talk about the film Death by Design. It's an investigative film. So let's start. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm going to talk today about a case study of a campaign that we ran for a film called Death by Design. And I chose Death by Design because it's an international story. So many of the films that we work on are made by US filmmakers. But Death by Design is a global story. And the campaign that we ran for it, although we're based in the US, was an international campaign. So we had community screenings and events and actions and partnerships that represented the globe. So I thought it was a good one to share today. To show that social impact campaigns, don't have to necessarily be localized, even if they're grassroots and meant to cultivate awareness in local areas. They can still be global in their scope. So I will talk a little bit about the film because I think only about maybe 2 or 3 of you have seen the film. The film is about the consumer electronics industry. And the impacts it has on the environment, on human rights, on labor practices, many of which are sort of unseen by us. So we're all consumers of these products, but we don't necessarily see the path that it takes to get from the idea of this product all the way through the supply chain to creating an iPhone, selling it in a retail. Okay, great, thanks. Selling it in a retail store, but then after it's been bought by a consumer, the rest of the lifespan of that particular piece of electronics, what happens when you upgrade, what happens when you give it away, what happens when it gets recycled. And so the Death by Design is really the story of the consumer electronics industry from so-called cradle to grave, from the conception of the product all the way to what happens when you throw that product away. So we'll start with the trailer, just so you can get a sense of the film before I begin.
106, lung cancer. 108, Hodgkin's lymphoma.
From almost the very beginning, you heard electronics. It was a clean industry.
110, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
What they weren't telling people was that they were storing very toxic chemicals underground. People started getting sick.
33,000 deaths in this corporate mortality file.
Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
How many electronic devices do you have? Definitely more than 10.
iPad, phone, PlayStation.
Over 500 pounds of raw material go into making an 8-ounce cell phone.
The purpose of outsourcing is to enable companies to make unreasonable demands that they couldn't make if they had to employ the workers directly.
You have an entire industry that's built on secrecy.
These are American-based companies. Hard to believe.
What they are doing is building the batteries into the phone and using proprietary screws in an attempt to limit the lifespan of the phone to around the time when they want you to buy a new one anyway.
We throw it away. My point is, where is away? Away is here for someone.
We have nearly 300 million rural residents who don't have access to sufficient safe drinking water.
Air pollution travels around the globe. These are what people refer to as tipping points. That's what we're very concerned about.
Money has been significant when it comes to the bottom line in life, really.
Okay, so, because most of you have not seen the film, I thought I would just kind of recap some of the main points from the film so you can sort of understand the story that we were working with and the kind of impact that we were intending to create with the film. So one of the things that the film covers is the environmental impact of the consumer electronics industry. So how many people, raise your hand if you have a smartphone? Yeah, everyone. Raise your hand if you have a laptop. Yeah, everyone. Raise your hand if you have a television. Yeah, DVD player, less so. Okay, yeah, so we all are implicated, right? All of us are consumers of these products, but we often don't have a sense of what the kind of macro effects of these products are. And one of the things that the film outlines is that toxic pollution from burning the e-waste. So when we upgrade, when we replace our phone with a new phone, and even if you do the right thing and you bring your phone to a recycling center, or your municipality or your city collects electronic waste, even then, typically what happens is the e-waste gets sent to a developing country, usually China, and then it gets taken apart and it's often burned. So it's often taken apart or deconstructed or recycled in a way that's harmful to the environment. So this is the grave part of the lifespan of the electronics. If you're thinking about cradle to grave, from the cradle, that's from the outset of the manufacture of the electronics. There's also environmental pollutants that are developed, that are released during that phase. But then when the life cycle is over, the toxic pollution is creating air pollution. In addition, there's soil contamination. So scientists estimate that 20% of China's farmland is contaminated with toxic heavy metals. So it's not just air pollution, it's also soil contamination. The food supply is also contaminated. So about 30% of China's rice is contaminated with another heavy metal, cadmium, which is in cell phone batteries. And this causes cancer, liver disease, bone diseases, respiratory illnesses. And often e-waste dismantling, or what we think of kind of optimistically as recycling, it's often done by children. It's often done by families in rural China, whole towns that are sort of dedicated, the industry that dominates or the economic kind of lifeblood of these towns is dismantling e-waste. So children in these communities often have very, very high levels of lead in their bloodstream, lead and cadmium. Which, as we know, has dire health effects. That's the environmental side and the human health side, but there's also a human rights side of the story. And as you learn in the film, and I do encourage you to see it on the 28th, much of the American electronics industry is outsourced. The manufacturer is outsourced, again, typically in China. And the pay is so low for workers in the electronics industry that the labor costs make up barely 1% of the iPhone cost. So it's an extremely expensive phone, but just 1% of the cost of the phone, the consumer cost of the phone, goes toward labor costs. And that's why the American electronics industry outsources it. Then you have the fraud. So up to 90% of global electronics waste is illegally traded or dumped. So even when it is recycled by the consumer, there is an illegal recycling market that's very poorly regulated. And then in the US, it's not just outside of the US. In the US, the manufacture of these products, particularly in the early days at IBM, 20, 30, 40 years ago, there are environmental and human health impacts that are still being felt in the communities where early consumer electronics were produced. So there's a storyline in the film, for example, of the town where IBM computers started. There's a cancer cluster there. Solvents leaked from the factories. Storage tanks are in the soil, and there's a massive cancer cluster in those communities that is still ongoing. So what did we want to do? The story is dire. It exposes some extremely harsh realities about the consumer electronics industry, but it also proposes solutions, and it's results-oriented and optimistic in certain ways. And we really wanted to use the film to accomplish three things. We wanted to educate people. We wanted to build coalitions with the film, so use the film to bring people together who maybe don't work together typically. As I mentioned, the film specifically showcases the hidden ills of the electronic industry, environmental destruction, human health impacts, labor abuses, and human rights abuses. And so the organizations that are working on those four issues, they don't always work together. Human rights entities often work specifically in the human rights sector. Environmentalists work in the environmentalist sector. But in order to solve these problems, really these communities of advocates and stakeholders are going to need to come together. And so that was why coalition building was really important to us. And then lastly, corporate mobilization. So, at the end of the day, many of these policies need to be changed from within the corporations. Corporate policy making needs to change, corporate governance needs to change. But of course, that's not something that can necessarily be enacted at the grassroots level. So what we wanted to do with the film is to help mobilize corporate efforts to document what could be done, and to work with corporations that were already taking an interest in corporate social responsibility efforts that would push the needle in the right direction. So how did we do this? What is grassroots distribution? To describe and understand grassroots distribution, you need to understand conventional distribution, which probably most people in this room, are recipients of and participants in. In conventional distribution, decision-making about how a film gets out to audiences, out into the world, is top-down, right? So a film is sold, let's say, to Netflix, or a film is sold to a studio. And the decision-making happens at the corporate level. So the marketing plan, the timeline, the opportunities to roll out the film in specific markets at a specific time, the price point that's put on the film, all of those are top-down decisions that are made at the outset of the film's release. It's characterized by control. The corporation controls the release of the film, all of the marketing decisions. The content, the film itself, is handled as like a product. And audiences are the consumers, and that's the traditional, conventional distribution mindset, is that the audience is going to purchase and transact to receive the content, and then it's done, right? That's kind of the end of the road for conventional distribution. In grassroots distribution, we try to flip each of those things to its opposite. So decision-making in grassroots distribution is ground up. At Film Sprout, what we have done is to say, instead of telling people, audiences, okay, the film is coming out on May 12th in these theaters, 7 o'clock, here's the ticket price, come or don't come, it's up to you. Kind of presenting a plan that the audience then has only one choice but to respond to. Instead, our idea was to actually tell audiences, hey, here's this film that's available. There's this window of availability. You tell us how you want to show it, who you want to show it to, the setting you want to put it in, and give them lots of freedom and flexibility with how they can actually determine the precise ways in which that film is received and experienced in their community. So we're kind of flipping the triangle. Grassroots distribution is also characterized by access. So rather than being characterized by control from the corporate distributor, the idea is that we make it possible and fluid for the audience to have access to the film within some parameters, but we give people the power and the freedom to use the film in the way that they would like to see it. Social equity is the product, so the idea is not just to sell the content, the idea is to create an experience around the content, to bring people together, to use the forum of a film screening, which is by its nature, it's an in-person human interaction, to create that as the product. That becomes the item that we're trying to sell, not the film itself. And then lastly, the audience becomes the creator. The audience is a participant in the distribution process. Further, what we try to create from a philosophical standpoint, is a virtuous circle. So we try to create a chain of events that reinforces itself through a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop. And I'll show you what I mean by that. At the top of the virtuous circle for film, you have a film that has a clear agenda for social change. So with Death by Design, the clear agenda was, we want to use this film to educate, to create coalitions, and to mobilize corporations. Three very clear goals. And we knew we wanted to enact those goals through a grassroots screening strategy. The integration of that cause with the marketing and distribution mechanisms makes it possible. So if you want to activate people at the grassroots, you want teachers to use a film in schools, you want corporations to use the film to educate their consumers about what their supply chain looks like and how it's positive, then you need to choose a distribution mechanism that matches that goal. And so the grassroots screening tour was the way that we could execute the distribution in a way that would accomplish those goals. When you do that, when you have a marketing and distribution plan that matches your agenda for social change, then you begin to get cause-motivated audiences. So you get audiences who are coming to your film not just for entertainment, but because they care about the issue. They're advocates, they're stakeholders. And when you have advocates and stakeholders in your audience, you then get support from the partnership networks that support those causes. So you then tap into a wellspring of organizational support that can help you forward your goals. Then you get an expanded audience. So instead of just getting a documentary film audience, people who are excited about documentary film, you get environmentalists, you get human rights advocates, you get people who are working for social change in labor regulation, which maybe wouldn't have normally embraced a documentary, but because you've cultivated those audiences, you now have that audience to bring to your film. And then you make more money, and then you can have a better change, a better plan for change. So these are mutually reinforcing sort of cycle that you want to set into motion. So what did we do with Death by Design? On the education front, we wanted to provide easy programming for nonprofit organizations. So organizations, zero-waste campus organizations, public libraries, workers' rights or labor organizations, repair cafes. Do you guys know what repair cafes are? Have you ever heard of them? Yeah. So they're really fun. They're these grassroots gatherings. They're not super well known in the U.S. either, but they're growing. And essentially, what you do is, if something breaks, your lamp breaks at home, your watch stops working, your phone stops working, the battery dies in your DVD player. You can bring it to a repair cafe, and they're often actually held in places like this, like old warehouses or community centers, and you come with your broken lamp and you fix it. You learn how to fix it yourself. You learn how to rewire it. You learn how to replace a watch battery. You learn how to replace a component in your iPhone. And so the idea is to create a community around repair instead of a community around just sort of consumer capitalist planned obsolescence. The idea is to kind of foment the opposite, kind of morality around a film. So repair cafes would show the film, recycling outreach programs. In the US, the Environmental Protection Agency, the agency responsible for environmental policies in the US, they used it for staff trainings. So the idea was really just, a film is a very easy way to kind of plug and play an educational experience. We also wanted to provide a ready-made curriculum for teachers, so the film came with a discussion guide so that educators at the high school and college level could use the film, and then they would have ready-made lesson plan and talking points. And then lastly, we wanted to be able to provide a forum for fundraising for these organizations so that an organization could sell tickets to their event and they could raise money for their own causes. So again, that's the virtuous circle effect. You want to kind of use a film to continue to support the work of the organizations on the ground. So here's an example. The film was used at Bucknell University as a free screening during the Campus Sustainability Month. And April is the month it's Earth Month. It's when Earth Day falls. So we planned the campaign so we would be sure that it would hit during April, so that government agencies, community groups, college campuses that are doing Earth Day programming would use the film. Coalition building. So we wanted to connect previously unaligned organizations. So for example, there was a collaboration between a solid waste district, so a government agency in this one particular region responsible for waste collection and recycling, partnered with a university sustainability office. So the film kind of allows people, strangers, to meet. It creates, odd bedfellows of people. The idea being that organizations that might not find a reason to work together might come together around a film because it's fun, it's engaging. Here's an example. The Lower East Side Ecology Center in New York City hosted an event with the Lower East Side Girls Club. So there's a nonprofit that's focused on helping girls succeed, and an organization that focuses on environmental education, and they work together. And as you can see, they sold tickets for $45, which is a pretty high ticket price. About 10 times what an average ticket price is for a community screening. So it was used as a fundraiser. And so this is another example of the way in which the film could sort of support the on-the-ground work of the stakeholders in that particular place. And then lastly, corporate and consumer mobilization. So we wanted to be able to offer consumers some kind of call to action. And this is a common issue with documentaries. You can watch them and they're like a little oppressive because you learn, raise your hand if you've watched a documentary and then you just feel sort of like depressed afterwards. You're just like hopeless. What can I do? What power do I have? And that's kind of sort of the opposite feeling, that from the one that we want to create. We want to create a feeling of advocacy. We want people to feel mobilized and motivated by their emotions. But in order to do that, you have to have a plan. If you just show the film and you let people, sort of go back into their lives, they might feel hopeless. They might not feel like there's like concrete next steps they can take. And so we wanted to give people a very specific call to action. And so we did some research with the film team to figure out which organizations were doing a good job, which corporate organizations were already doing a good job of this. And the film team, during the making of the film, had already begun to make some of these relationships. So then we were able to parlay those early relationships into some concrete calls to action. One of them was a company called iFixit. iFixit is an organization in California that they essentially, every time a new product is made, a new consumer product is made, like a new iPhone comes out, they do what they call tear downs. So they deconstruct, you guys are familiar with this, they deconstruct the machine on camera so you can see how it works. And they show step-by-step how you can fix the problems so that you don't have to buy a new one. So that when, so for example, in the film, we learned that, iPhone batteries are specifically designed, are specifically designed so that they won't have a long lifespan. And so that when your battery dies, you're tempted to buy the newest version, the next version of the iPhone. And iFixit basically shows you how you can replace your own battery so that you don't need to buy a new one. So they're trying to kind of counteract very practically at a consumer level this idea, the kind of culture of planned obsolescence, and this idea that you always have to have the next device, which then precipitates the need for recycling your old device. So their philosophy, they have this repair manifesto, and they say if you can't fix it, you don't really own it. You're not really, they're trying to change the thinking about what consumerism actually looks like, what ownership actually looks like. And so they're focused on repair. And then this is a screenshot from their website, and you can literally go to each, if you have a laptop, a Mac laptop, if you have an iPhone, car repairs, cameras, Androids, gaming devices, and you can click on them, and then there's hundreds of devices, and you can literally learn step-by-step how to repair most common issues. They'll even send you the tools you need, because with iPhones, for example, there's proprietary tools that only Apple owns, like little screwdrivers that only Apple uses. And so iFixit has researched those tools and replicated them, and so you can have them shipped to your house so that you can make the repair yourself. So they're trying to kind of undo this culture of planned obsolescence. And there's actually a video, the iFixit video.
Want to know how to replace that cracked screen on your phone? Or maybe you want to know if the newest gadget is worth the sticker shock? Then you've come to the right place. iFixit's team of repair experts and tinkerers are here to guide you through product teardowns and helpful repairs for your favorite devices. We also like to share repair stories and answer your questions during live streams. If you ever wanted to see the guts of your favorite gadgets or learn some DIY repair skills, then check out our videos. We can help you fix anything from cell phones and computers to tablets and game consoles. Our repair guides might even help you cross a few household repairs off your weekend to-do list. Whether you're an expert DIYer or a first-time fixer, iFixit.com has everything you need to complete DIY electronics repair. From thousands of free step-by-step repair guides to our huge inventory of quality-tested replacement parts and tools, iFixit's got your repair needs covered. Click that subscribe button to be the first to see our new videos every week. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and share your repair photos with us using #iFixit. Happy fixing!
Okay, so we worked with iFixit, and we thought, okay, well, how can we very practically give people a solution so they watch the film and they feel bad about their iPhone and they feel bad that they've just upgraded it or they've just recycled it? How can we give people sort of a constructive and hopeful tool? And so iFixit, they provided us with the repair manifesto, so we put that in every single screening kit. So as we shipped out DVDs and Blu-rays across the country for our, across the world, really, for our Grassroots screening tour, everybody got an iFixit repair manifesto, and everybody got postcards and stickers so that they would be aware of iFixit. And we would encourage them in the discussion materials and in the materials that shipped with their package to use the iFixit resources. Then we also partnered with Patagonia. So Patagonia is one of the companies that has done a really sort of outward-facing job of making sure that their supply chain is clean, what they call a clean supply chain. And that manifests in different ways across different products, but with their clothing, the idea is that they're going to provide transparency around where their clothing is sourced, where it comes from, that it's going to be good for the environment, and again, that there's going to be this cradle-to-grave trajectory that's considered when they make their products. So the idea is not just in the manufacturing, then in the retail life of the film, then in the consumer life of the film, but then what happens when that product is at the end of its life? How can it get recycled? And they began a couple of years ago a program called Wornwear. The idea was that people could take their gently used Patagonia clothing and return it to Patagonia to be repurposed and purchased by someone else. So this is kind of like an anti-capitalist mode for a company, for a privately held corporation to be in, because they're essentially enabling people to not buy more new products. But they've baked it into the ethos of their brand so that they actually have created a clientele and a consumer base that buys Patagonia products specifically because they have the sustainable life cycle and because there's transparency around sourcing and around the cradle-to-grave lifespan of those products. So we partnered with the Wornwear program at Patagonia. They were doing, in the spring of 2017, a college tour around the U.S., a physical tour. So they had literally these trucks, and they took them to college campuses around the country, and the idea was for them to showcase what the Wornwear program looked like on college campuses, but they showed Death by Design every time they went. So they showed the film, and then they gave the consumers, the students on those college campuses, a lesson, and an experience of how they could actually repurpose their materials. So this allowed us, again, to do that coalition building. So we were working kind of outside of the electronics space, but using a film about electronics to communicate the importance of the repair mentality. So if you guys can load up that video, the last one. Yeah, so again, the idea, like, if it's broke, fix it instead of replace it. And they went to 21 colleges. They showed Death by Design at a number of those colleges. There's another film they also showed about the textile industry and the sort of hidden ills of the textile industry. So it was a good match for Death by Design. There we go. And then lastly, we partnered with Good Electronics. Good Electronics is a nonprofit organization that's based in Europe, and they are specifically working on initiatives to change policies from within corporations. So Good Electronics has, they have a petition that's essentially corporate facing, so it's not a consumer petition, but it's a pledge that they have worked with corporations to uphold, that is intended to change the way corporations think about the supply chain that they're creating for their electronics. And the principles that Good Electronics has essentially researched and then proposed to corporations is these 5 components. So they're encouraging corporations to be transparent, so that workers and communities and consumers know what goes into the production of consumer electronics, what chemicals are being used in the manufacture, and what hazards might be caused by their production or their dismantling. Use safer chemicals, so take those worst chemicals out of the supply chain completely and out of the manufacturing process completely, and replace them with alternatives that are safer. Protect workers. So this gets to the labor piece. How can you provide hazard monitoring for workers from the manufacturing process through the retail process and then in the recycling process? How can you protect communities and the environment? And then lastly, how can corporations compensate and remediate the harm that they've caused? Because, you know, as you'll see in the film when you watch it, the environmental and human health effects are generational. You know, they're not just short-term ill effects. They are effects that are now being seen in a second generation of people. So women who worked in factories while they were pregnant, their children were born with birth defects. So there's extremely long-term harms that have been caused, and there is Good Electronics is focusing on how can we remediate some of that harm. So we worked with change.org to create a petition that would essentially help that create a consumer-facing version of that Good Electronics petition. Good Electronics focused on corporate responsibility. So it focused on getting corporations to sign on to this petition. But we wanted to create something that after the film, if someone was feeling they wanted to do something, they could, as a consumer, essentially sign on to a consumer version of that petition that says, you know, we demand that these corporations sign this pledge. So ultimately, this was our final map of community screenings as of last year. We can add the Ukraine now to to the map, and this is, you know, there's been another, you know, dozens of additional screenings after this. But this was essentially after the 5 months of the very concentrated campaign, which brings me to an important point. If you're trying to create a grassroots campaign, you do typically want there to be one period where there's very concentrated activity, so that there's this sense of urgency, there's a sense of focus, that you can really sort of bring people's attention to the film when it's new, when it's coming out across different platforms. And so we worked on this campaign in the winter and spring of 2017, essentially between January and May. So there's this 5-month period where the focus was really intense. And these are the screenings that happened during those 5 months. Since then, you know, in the almost 2 years since we finished the campaign, there have been dozens of additional screenings. So it's not that the campaign completely ends, but our very proactive efforts stopped after the 5 months. Ultimately, in 5 months, we had 110 screenings. We worked with 68 unique organizations, 61 cities across 16 countries, and 8,800 people saw the film in those 5 months. So again, people continue to watch the film after that. The film is on iTunes. It's more, you know, readily available. There was a broadcast. the film was on Netflix. So there's an expanded footprint for the film beyond what our campaign did, but the idea is that in a very short period of time, you want these 8,800 people had a very robust experience of the film. So we know that these people didn't just watch the film, like at home in their pajamas. They watched the film in community setting. They took some kind of action afterwards. And yet there are challenges. So despite the fact that it was a successful campaign, we wanted to reach 100 screenings and we beat our goal. There's still challenges with a grassroots campaign that are very specific to the kind of grassroots framework. First of all, grassroots campaigns typically are funded by the sale of the film to each of those individual screening hosts. So in the case of this particular project, the filmmakers were able to hire Film Sprout because they had a charitable grant. But we had to kind of continue to fuel the work that we were doing by selling the film to each one of these organizations. And there's limited resources. So this is an international film, but every time you bring it to a new country, it has to be translated, subtitles need to be created, and that's an expensive process. And so there were limited resources for language translations, which means we really had to rely on film festivals, volunteers, advocates, stakeholders to help us translate the film each time. And that's an essential, that's an inherent challenge with a grassroots campaign. The other sort of obvious challenge is that the film criticizes major corporations, and all of us are sort of implicated as consumers of those corporations. We all sort of have these affinities as consumers, this love-hate relationship, let's say, with Apple or Samsung or other consumer electronics companies. And so what do you do when consumers have a brand affinity, but we want to try to allow people to see the dark side of that corporation? There's this inherent kind of struggle there. Policy making is very localized, so that's another challenge. This is a film that's international in scope. In the film, the filmmakers go to China, they go to Ireland, they are in the US. We see they're in Europe, we see the global scope of the issue. But in fact, most policies around manufacture, labor rights, environmental protections, human health are very, very localized. In the US in particular, they can be city specific. So it's not even necessary that one city to another in the same state has the same policies around recycling. And so then it's hard to kind of propose a one-size-fits-all action to take when these policies are very localized. So that was an inherent challenge. Conversion rates are always very low with grassroots campaigns. So, we reached out to more than 1,000 organizations to host screenings of the film. Individually reached out on my team, more than 1,000 emails and phone calls. But you only get about 10% of organizations actually have the capacity to host a screening. So there's a lot of effort that you have to put out to get the results that you want. And then the most likely organizations to commit are organizations that come through some kind of organizational partner, like the Patagonia or the iFixit, Good Electronics, Greenpeace. And those partnerships can take months. Those relationships can take months to build. But the film's release timeline is very short. So this is an inherent struggle for most films. How do you develop the relationships that are strong enough to deliver results, and then still maintain that sort of urgent moment that you need to take advantage of with the film, so that it feels fresh and new and exciting, and people act when you have their attention. So, if you're considering a grassroots impact campaign, there's some questions to ask first, because not every campaign is well suited to a grassroots strategy. And sometimes a grassroots strategy, as you learned in Megan's presentation yesterday, if you were here, sometimes a grassroots strategy is just one piece of a much larger impact campaign. And I think you'll learn that tomorrow with Rebecca Ashdown too. Sometimes a grassroots campaign is just one pillar of a larger social change campaign for a film. But should you pursue grassroots distribution? I think one question is, does your film have a call to action that an individual consumer can take advantage of. Sometimes there's a film that's about policy, and really an individual consumer has no control over that policy, except as a voting member of society. And that might not be as good a fit for a grassroots campaign. Does your film showcase the efforts of ordinary citizens? So this is something that we've learned time and again. If your film tells the story of an activist or an advocate or someone who has been successful as a grassroots organizer, it is going to engender the kind of emotion that makes people want to act individually. But if your film is not about that and it doesn't showcase that, you're going to have a much harder time translating the storytelling of that film into some kind of grassroots action. Does ground-up organizing already exist? This is something that we have seen, sometimes a film doesn't yet have a community. There aren't yet advocates. The issue is very new. Maybe the film is investigating something for the first time and it's a story that's not widely known. It can be much harder to organize when people haven't yet begun to organize around that particular issue. Do prospective partner organizations have chapter-based populations? Do they have localized initiatives? When you're working with an organization that has chapters across the world or across the country, then you can tap into that infrastructure and your job is a lot easier. Does your distribution deal allow for direct-to-consumer sales? So sometimes, and increasingly, we're seeing this with companies like Netflix, where they buy all the rights and then it's not available for the film team to actually distribute the film in community screenings. Or it's available but only after some negotiation. Or additional funds can't be raised through the sale of those licenses, so then the campaign is less sustainable financially. So these are things to consider at the outset. And then finally, does your film engage audiences at a gut level? Sometimes a film is really intellectual or it's really stimulating in terms of dialogue and conversation, but it's not activating people in their hearts. And I think that grassroots campaigns work best when there is this kind of gut punch that you get and you're really mobilized at the human level. That's what inspires people to act. Information alone doesn't inspire people to take action. They have to really feel like they're emotionally implicated. And that's something that no impact campaign can create. The film has to create that sense of emotional urgency. That's it. And I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, for your presentation. Thanks a lot. And let's ask. So, guys, you have a question, yeah? Okay.
Thank you a lot. We are actually, with my colleagues, are thinking about a campaign, but I hope it will be such you have, but we need to do the first step. So I have a few questions. First one, how do you connect in this, how do you keep in this connection with your participants of your events? Maybe you have,
Yeah. So I think the question is, how do we connect with people, maintain a relationship with the people who actually come to these screenings? Yeah, that is a really great question. So there's a number of ways that we do this. Some of them are very practical, very, very simple. So at every screening, we seek to collect people's email addresses. Email addresses more than social media, more than sort of other digital social tools is going to provide the strongest connection. So I have a colleague in this space who just says, like, emails are gold, because then you can have this communication that can be long-lasting. It can be tricky to do that because it's not a 100% accurate process or comprehensive process, but we work with the local screening host, the person who's organizing the event, and we essentially explain the importance of gathering emails so that we can connect people to the next steps after a screening. And then that screening host usually provides sort of the glue between us as a company and the film team, and then the end audience. So that screening host is like the local representative. They're sort of like our ambassador to these communities that are very localized. We also encourage people to provide feedback after the film. So when the film screening is over, we provide the screening host with two things: a survey to fill out to talk about their perception of the screening as an organizer. And then we also typically include surveys, like little tear sheet surveys, so that audiences, the ticket buyers or the attendees at the screening can also offer feedback about the issue. So that we get feedback from the organizer and then from the people attending the event. And that helps us understand, what did we do right, what did we do wrong? It helps us understand what the impact of the campaign might be. And then lastly, what I would say is that we try to provide as robust a digital presence for the film as possible. So in the case of Death by Design, every time someone signed the petition, they got a follow-up note that thanked them and encouraged them to join the Facebook channel. Then we would post on the Facebook page to kind of give updates about the film as it was rolling out. And the idea is, again, to create that feedback loop. So someone enters the cycle, let's say at a screening, but then they stay in touch through your social media, through your email newsletter, through the petition signing. Or maybe they see the petition first and then they want to host a screening of the film. So the idea is that you're giving people multiple points of entry into the ecosystem of the film's, grassroots campaign.
I see. And one more question.
Yeah.
Thank you a lot.
Yeah.
And how do you count in the results of these actions? Maybe you have some questionnaire, but how do you sure that some actions are more I don't know, have much more
the effective than others.
Yes.
So this is a really big question in the impact producing space. Like, how do we measure whether we've succeeded? And I think it's tricky because film is it's a medium for social change, but it's not social change itself necessarily. Yes. It might be, like, you might actually have someone might have an experience watching the film where, like, everything changes and all of their behavior changes and their voting changes and their personal consumer habits change. But we might never know, right, whether that's true or not. We can guess that it's true, but it's very hard to measure. And so this is something that I think the international community of impact producers is really trying to figure out. How do we measure these things? With a film like Death by Design, I think there's some metrics that we can use. We can see, how many people signed the petition, how many people downloaded the repair manifesto, how many people attended a screening, how many organizations did some kind of direct action at their screening. So for example, some people at their screenings actually did e-waste collection at their screenings. So in the promotion of their screening, they would say, come bring your used electronics and we'll make sure they're recycled effectively. So then there's this sort of baked in social impact that's happening at that screening. But so far, I think this is an open question for the industry, is should there be a standardized metric across all films where we say this counts as success and this doesn't? Or is every film and every social issue so different that success looks different for every project? I mean, we've worked on campaigns in the US where a law changed, or a government agency changed its policies, or a person was voted into office or voted out of office. Those are really obvious changes that you can really document in this very concrete way. But then there's also like the softer changes. There's behavior change, there's attitude change, there's awareness building and education. And sometimes those things I think can take like a generation or 2 generations to change. So I think it's important that we stay humble and we say, like, this film is one piece of a much larger pre-existing movement to revolutionize the way the global consumer electronics supply chain is being handled. It's not going to solve the entire problem, but it can be a tool.
Thank you.
If you're interested in that topic, I would definitely say to follow the Global Impact Producers Alliance. Global Impact Producers Alliance. There's a listserv which is managed by Doc Society. Do you guys know Doc Society? They're based in London and New York.
I don't know whether our audience knows, but there
Yeah.
is your email. So I think
Yes.
that
Reach out.
so you could write Caitlin
Yeah.
and ask her some questions concerning distributors or some practical issues.
Yeah.
I think that she will
There's
be
a
glad
lot
to
of-
answer.
Yeah, there's a lot of resources out there that are grappling with that question.
Do we have one more question? Okay.
Thank you again for the film and the presentation. My question is more of a practical one. You mentioned that the grassroots method, it was based on, you tell people that here we have a film, we have a campaign, and please tell us where do you want us to screen it.
Yes.
And did you have a platform of people, a community to start with? Or how did you find this first community?
Yeah, how do we
thank you.
find the audiences? Yeah, so it's a combination. There's a combination of ways that we find audiences. One is that, yes, over time, Film Sprout has done this work for 10 years. So over time, we built a community of people who we could go to again and again, particularly on specific issues. So we could say, okay, in our database, there's these few thousand people who are interested in environmental issues or human rights issues or labor issues. So part of it was that we cultivated this community over time. But actually what we learned is that there's only about a 14% repeat screening host rate. So of our whole database, only about 14% of them hosted more than one film. And that's partially because every film is very different, and every film covers different ground and different issue. And someone who's really interested in, e-waste disposal is maybe not going to be interested in, domestic violence issues, or is not going to be interested in, issues related to women and medicine, like Unrest, the case study for tomorrow. So there's not as much overlap as you would hope, much to our dismay. So then we do bespoke research. And what we do is we reach out to organizations across the world that we think are aligned with the causes of the film. And that takes an enormous amount of staff time. But we feel that for every film, I mentioned with Death by Design, we reached out to more than 1,000 organizations. And I would say probably 200 or 300 of those were organizations we already knew. And the rest of them were people that we reached out to cold. We just reached out to explaining the film, encouraging them to join. And then the last way is through relationship building. So, finding an organization that maybe has deeper relationships in that space so that you're not having to approach organizations completely cold. And the filmmakers, in the case of Death by Design, the filmmakers had been working on those issues for months as they were making the film, as they met people, as they did research, they were kind of accruing these relationships. And so when we came on board, when the film was finished, they were able to introduce us to specific people who they thought could be helpful, and then those people made introductions for us. So it's a combination of all of those things, but it's very labor intensive.
So if I understood correctly, you mostly really just reach out for people, for communities, and ask them hear the film, and you can. Okay, I understood. Thank you a lot.
Yeah, it's a very low-tech approach.
Thank you. Can you explain a bit more how do you define community screening? Is it do you count like festival screenings as a community screening? Does community screening must be followed by some conversation? When do you decide to sell or not to sell tickets or show it for free and so on?
Yeah. So I think community screenings as a term is a little bit fluid. It can mean different things to different people. In general, we consider something to be a community screening when it's taking place outside of the conventional distribution infrastructure. So, a screening at a local cinema that's programmed by that cinema, we would consider that just a conventional theatrical run. But if an organizer or an educator or an advocate is bringing the film, doing all of the organizing on their end, it's not part of a release strategy, that would be a community screening. Some festivals, I think there's some gray area, some industry, if it's a big industry festival, we wouldn't consider that a community screening. If it's a film festival that's sort of serving the industry, and kind of its base of ticket buyers, we would not consider that a community screening. But some film festivals, particularly small ones, essentially are community screenings. So if they're not serving the film industry, if they're essentially, you know, let's say there's an environmental film festival that's in a small town, we would consider that a community screening because it's outside of the sort of industry infrastructure. Whether or not there's a discussion, you know, about 2/3 of the screenings, there is some kind of post-film programming. So in the majority of cases, there's, if not a discussion per se, there's a guest speaker, there's a panel discussion, there's a Q&A, or the filmmaker comes. Sometimes there's a direct action. Sometimes everybody gets up and volunteers after the screening, and there's this very sort of social impact programming that takes place after the film. So we're not, you know, I don't think there's like a strict definition. But generally speaking, we think of community screenings as being outside of the, you know, conventional theatrical infrastructure.
And one more question, did you make screenings to decision makers, to corporations, to politicians? And do you bring opposing sides like NGOs and corporations, for example, together?
Yeah, so it depends on the film, you know, and the specific policies that are, or issues that are outlined in the film. Some films have a very specific political agenda. So the idea is actually to change a piece of legislation, or it's to change the voting public's perception of a particular, you know, referendum or resolution. And in those cases, for those films, there's typically a very proactive political engagement strategy. So there might be someone who's actually working, let's say in the US, there's working in Capitol Hill to bring the film to members of Congress. We've worked on campaigns where there's a film, you know, screening for staffers in the US Senate and the US House of Representatives. So they actually watch it like while they're at work, you know, they have a lunch break and they watch the film during their lunch break, and their staffers and policymakers then take the issues of, you know, the talking points of those films back to the lawmakers. Sometimes we have shown films in state assemblies. You know, in the US, every state has its own, you know, typically its own House of Representatives and or Senate, and we have done kind of General Assembly screenings across the United States. Certainly, you know, some of the films that we've shown have shown in other countries' parliaments. So I think actually, I think Death by Design was shown in the Swedish Parliament. Yeah, in Denmark. Yeah, and we've done, you know, we've done screenings of other films in foreign parliaments too. So it really depends. It depends on whether that's the goal of the filmmaker to shift policy, and it also depends on whether there are lawmakers or policymakers who are already working on those issues. So it can sometimes be part of the strategy, but not always.
I'm just curious, what is the destiny of this film in China, and do they allow community screening there? Yeah,
so actually the filmmaker Sue Williams, she has a really good relationship. She serves, I think, on the board of or as a member of a U.S.-China relations organization, and so she was able to bring the film with her to China and present it there. And there have been a few screenings in China. You know, as Megan shared yesterday, a lot has changed in the last 2 years in terms of China's policies regarding recycling. And again, I don't think we can point to this film as being like the thing. You know, I think it's really hard to make a claim that any one tool is what changes an entire country's policies, even if it's credited with making that change. But I do think that in general, Death by Design is one of several films and several pieces of investigative reporting that have really pulled back the curtain on what it looks like to recycle, what the recycling industry looks like in China and how it's harming the environment and presenting, you know, human health and human rights challenges. And so I think it is part of the larger movement of media and reporting that has changed China's policies.
Thank you, Megan, because you showed the map, and mainly screenings occurred in
Europe
the USA
and
Europe,
yes.
and just a few stickers in Asia.
Yes. Yeah.
That's right. It's really a good question. Thank you.
Yes, and I'll add to that just quickly to say that some of that is an infrastructural or resource issue because the film didn't have enough funding to, let's say, provide the film for free, across the world. So every time we hosted a screening, we had to charge a fee, and also translation costs and subtitling costs are very high. So I think that's something to think about when you're thinking about a global strategy. It's like, do you have the resources to translate a film and then provide it at no cost to the end user? That's what you really need to do if you want to get into developing countries or places where there's not the general resources for licensing films.
Okay, thank you. And Tiara, one more question.
I'm wondering to know, does it work better when you have separate screens, for example, for, I don't know, deputy, for another group? So if it works better when you are taking them all, I mean, they're all...
together.
Yeah, together.
Yeah.
All kinds of...
Yeah.
All parts of the conflict. I don't know how to name them. Yeah.
Yeah.
How better to turn them on?
Right.
To make.
I think you need all the strategies. I think that a good campaign has different kinds of screenings, and so because for this campaign, coalition building was a big goal, and so yes, we wanted to get people from different sectors, different angles of the issue into the same room together. We wanted people who were talking about the human rights abuses to be talking to the people who work on environmental issues, for example. Because I don't think substantial change can happen unless all of those groups come together. That said, I think sometimes, bringing experts in a certain field who already have relationships with each other and they have sort of social capital with each other all together, sometimes you can be more efficient because everyone's on the same page and you're not crossing a big divide. So I think you need both. I think you need some screenings where the goal is really to get people to talk to each other who don't talk to each other and to have them find some common ground. And a film can be a really powerful way of doing that because it's entertaining and it's storytelling and there's sort of this emotional connection that can be made that can maybe help people rise above their sort of procedural differences or their expertise. But I also think that it's commonly said that films need to go beyond the choir, that you need to go beyond the people who already care about the issue. But I think that's a little simplistic because you also need to bring the film to people whose daily work is to change policies on those issues, change consumer behavior on those issues. The experts who are at the epicenter of those issues really have the most power to make change. And so I think you need to have both as part of your strategy. Social change is difficult and it needs to be very nuanced, I think.
I have a specific question regarding, it's more or less a back and forth question. You did say you had a lot of screenings in colleges and universities. That's correct, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How did you choose the faculties or the people that you wanted to screen the movie to?
We looked at the issues specific to the film, and we wanted to reach out to professors and students who were working in those particular issues. And so, the idea was really, let's look at these 4 issues that are covered in the film. Environmental issues, human rights, human health, labor issues, and bring the film to those disciplines.
Did you also consider maybe showing it to the faculties that are involved from the other side? So maybe for electrical engineers or electronics experts?
Yes.
Or the other side? Because
yeah. I think, yes, we did. There's often actually efforts from within those colleges. So I think an important distinction to understand with grassroots distribution is that you're letting the organization on the ground have control. So it's not a top-down strategy where you're saying I'm going to pick you and you and you and you're going to screen the film the way I want you to. The idea is that you're empowering the audience on the ground, the screening host on the ground, to cultivate their own audience. So in many cases on these college campuses, the sustainability office, let's say, might be the one that hosted the screening, but then they would bring in people from their campus from, yes, electrical engineering department, from the tech, IT department, from the ethics department, from the School of International Affairs. So the idea would be that the audience was a cross-section, and the panelists would often represent a cross-section of the university, too.
I'm not sure if my question is relevant in the context of discussion, but do these companies like iFixit have any issues with Apple or any other major companies who work like in this large capitalistic system,
right?
Who are more or less would be like against these ideas?
I don't know. That's actually a good question. Not that I'm aware of, like in terms of like a lawsuit or, that kind of thing, but I don't know for sure. It's possible that there have been some conflicts. I think what iFixit's particular approach has been is to empower the consumer. And so they're sort of providing the consumer with the tools that they need to have what they call like full ownership of their own devices. And maybe that's the way that they sort of skirt, because they're not directly competing with Apple, let's say. But I don't know, it's possible that there have been conflicts or sort of legal actions. I'm not aware of them if there are.
Because I was wondering, like, Apple will see this, like, oh, you're constructing some tools that are hacking our products, so subsequently you're violating some our rights,
intellectual property or something. Yeah, I mean, I think sadly with a lot of the films that we've worked on where there's corporate power involved, it's kind of like the best case scenario if the corporation sues the other party, because it shows that actually they might be powerful enough to impact the corporation. We worked on a campaign several years ago about plastic bags, plastic pollution, and the lobbying group, the Lobbying and Trade Association for Disposable Plastics, which is an international lobbying group, they actually mounted a whole website in opposition to the film, and their CEO gave a speech about how the film was lies and myths and propaganda, and it was it was a huge success, because even though this huge kind of corporate trade association was coming after the film, so to speak, it showed that they were scared. It showed that that they felt like there was something at risk. And it was a huge win for the film. And so I think that could kind of be the best outcome, right? If Apple is scared of iFixit.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And to follow up with that question, do you or your filmmakers personally faced some threats or something like that from some of the antagonists of your films? And how do you protect you and your filmmakers in such case, especially if there may be some real violence involved? For example, if you make something like, I don't know, anti-Trump or anti-far-right movements, and it's real some danger in place.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, of all of the films that we've worked on, there have been a number where we had security concerns. There was a film that we worked on several years ago called The Invisible War, which was about the epidemic of sexual assault within the U.S. military. And that was a film where, the film was specifically critical of policies and decision makers within the Department of Defense at in the U.S., but potentially the most powerful institution in the world, arguably. And there were some concerns about whether there would be, not so much retaliation, but just that the subjects of the film, more than the filmmakers or the distributors, that the subjects of the film, the individual people who were whistleblowing, that they would be imperiled, that they wouldn't be safe. And so there were, precautions taken to make sure that they were kept safe. We represented a film in 2014 called Vessel. I don't know if it's shown in the Ukraine, but It's a film about Rebecca Gompertz. She's an activist, abortion rights activist, and she sails a ship to countries in the world. There are 5 countries in the world where abortion is completely illegal under all circumstances, and she is Dutch, and she sails a ship under the Dutch flag, and she brings it into the ports of countries where abortion is illegal, and women board the ship, and she goes out to international waters, and she performs the medical abortion with a pill, and then brings them back to land. So she's a real, like, renegade, you know. She's found a loophole in the international laws to be able to provide healthcare to women. And that was a film where, you know, in the United States, abortion is a very hot button issue. It's a extremely politicized issue, and we were really concerned that there could be, at screenings, there could be anti-abortion protesters, there could be violence, and actually nothing happened, thank God, in the U.S. We had more than 200 screenings. There were no incidents, but it did show in Stockholm, and there was an anti-abortion activist in Stockholm who threw a firebomb into the screening room. Nobody was hurt, but it was very scary at a screening that we had booked. So that was a surprising outcome. We didn't think Stockholm, of all places, would be a place where that would happen. But I think we're always aware of it, and we take precautions to kind of make sure that at these grassroots screenings that there is adequate, if we do think there's a security threat, that there is adequate protection. But luckily, it hasn't. No, we haven't had any major incidents.
Thank you. So, yeah. Caitlin, how many devices do you have?
I have a laptop and an iPhone, as you see. We were talking earlier. My laptop is from 2011.
That's mine.
And we represented this film in 2017, and I haven't been able to replace it ever since. So, yeah, it definitely made an impact on me.
Yeah, this film also. I decided to change my computer maybe in several years. So.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Yeah, if you want to replace your devices, don't watch the film.
Yeah, because afterwards you will feel this impact to live as it is. Okay.
That's right.
Thank you, Caitlin, very much.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you.